Okay. The 1982 Falklands War failed to quell long-term Argentine ambitions. See, already with the words, they're trying to, ambitions. Like, it's not a dispute that they really take to heart that has been in part of uh, their country's political sentiment since for 150 years. It's not a need to want to be a good country, or it's not a proper manner of handling an age-old dispute, an injustice they feel Britain committed against them 150 years or 200 years ago, 187 years ago now, almost 88. No, it's an ambition, that they want to grab stuff. These have once again resurfaced since lying dormant. Recently, since lying dormant. No, not true. Um, they never lied dormant. If there's anything, that's why it's so important that the Argentinians get their half of the story out into equality with this British narrative, because it's completely allowing the British to create a narrative that it almost seems like quietly and secretly the narrative is constructed upon the opposite to make sure it pushes people in the opposite direction of what the Argentine narrative, their truth and their argument is about. And so instead of saying the Argentinians have always, throughout the years, resurfaced with the various presidents, those who didn't, kiss butt and sold out to have economic favor by putting the islands in the back burner, would always reoccur and say, we're not forgetting, let's make another move, because frankly, the world makes it impossible to resolve things through diplomacy. You know, it's like, look at the Palestinian situation. The United Nations is not doing at all what it has proposed to the world, which is to solve things through talking. As soon as a country has power, as soon as a country can manipulate or blackmail another country to do something, or as soon as they can infiltrate or intervene, they do. That's the reality of the world. It's not what the United Nations was supposedly created for. And so, but all in all, Argentina has been consistently diplomatic civilized about this. The British don't want to say that. They don't want to say that. They don't want to say, fair enough, the Argentinians never raised a rifle in the air until the junta ended up doing, or tricked into doing what they did. Let's give them that. No, because then that would start, because they're always aware of what are people going to how are people going to understand this conflict. And so if they yield, if they say that truth, then they risk a little bit of, people starting to say, well, then the Argentinians have some rights to the islands in any case. That's what it's all about. It's all about winning over the public, the international public ear, the way of understanding, the way that people are educated to believe and understand and reason what this is about. And it's completely unfair because it's a huge subject, I mean to say, because it speaks of how much advantage the American Britain have after the war and it's already, English was already, they're capitalizing on the use of their own language to forge education, understanding, comprehension, beliefs according to their interests. That's normal. I mean, a lot of people say, you only take care of your own benefit. People only care about themselves. It's not true. But it's interesting to compare countries and people relationships, people psychology, interaction, social interaction between people and countries, because in some ways, countries do behave and express, manifest what people do. In other ways, a country or government is but an instrument. And like an instrument, like a human invention, it's easier to be less than your higher self. In other words, you may not attack somebody if you're face to face with them, but if you have a club in your hand and the other person, maybe their foot is stuck in the mud or in cement, which is a human invention, it makes it easier for us to be more primitive and attack and use that gun and trick that person to step into their cement or something. So in that sense, countries express the lesser side of ourselves. We don't have to suffer the judgment of social witnessing when we rob, for example, which if you live in a small town and you rob something from somebody, you probably won't do it because people see you, your friends know it, and so the stability of social congeniality is stable, is more secured. But when you work through invention, when you work through something that you can machine behind and you can operate, all of a sudden other parts of our human mind wield that mechanical ability to express its lesser side. So we're more unjust and more abusive and more shamelessly thieving or lying or deceiving as nations than we would be naturally as people socially. It's really interesting. And so there's this dichotomy where also you can analyze interactions between nations as the true motives that arise in human nature naturally. And you can also see how much easier it is for people to be their worst selves through the application of instrument. Okay. Recently, President Alberto Fernandez announced policies relating to the strengthening of claims towards the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. Malvinas Islands. They don't say Falklands. They say the Malvinas Islands. Yeah, it's true. But that's exactly what we're saying is good. He created a ministry, what do you call it? A commission or a ministry in the government to bring more sophistication to developing a better national policy towards a dispute, which is exactly the reason we created the United Nations, to solve things through diplomacy and negotiation and talking, law and these things. And yet this article wants to condemn him. And incredibly, these three articles I read before have to do with Argentina's intent on making it a diplomatic matter in which its government is more capable of engaging Britain or the United Nations or the International Court of Justice with a richer, more complex presentation of their argument. And that is being used to blame Argentina for being belligerent, justifying Boris Johnson and saying and calling out war. If you dare become more aggressive, if you dare try to seek more peaceful means for resolution, we'll go to war. That's what the interaction is. This is why it's so fascinating. This is what is happening right now. Because they don't want, by agitating and rattling they say Argentina is rattling the sabers. It's them who's rattling the saber. They can force people to go, "Ooh, what's happening?" and not look at the subtle history and the narrative that has to do with Argentina's history and claim to these islands. Um, at the 75th UN General Assembly, he called on the UK to resume negotiations that have gathered dust for 55 years. This action represents Fernandez's peaceful intentions for the Falklands, but this has elicited little response from. Now he's sounding. It's interesting because he uses language to make Argentina seem like the bad guy, the ambitious, whatever. But now it's describing it in something that appears more to be closer to what really is the case. He called on UK to resume negotiations that have gathered dust for 55 years. This action represents Fernandez's peaceful intentions for the Falklands, but this has elicited little response from British MPs, but garnered praise by domestic campaigns of anti-occupation, especially in Tierra del Fuego region. Yeah, well, because Argentinians have always had passion for this. The problem is that when the country, like so many Latin American countries, and this is a whole other subject, but basically they kind of split. They have this schizophrenia. America too has one, I don't know. It isn't really schizophrenic in America. There's supposedly a progressive against liberal capitalism, but in reality, the people that carry out policy for the government internally and internationally are pretty consistent, aside from apparent facade changes that would even appear radical sometimes or sudden, long awaited for. In reality, the United States is much more consistent in its dealing with itself. Argentina has, although it seems to also be expressing this bipolar trap of fighting between two polar opposites and never allowing the people to understand how things work. I'm going somewhere else again. But the Latin American countries, in particular after the 70s, have been suffering like the tide pools of America intervening in Chile and Guatemala and everywhere, in different places, Ecuador, Argentina has always been kind of we don't know if we're going to let you grab our arm like that, and so that's why there's always been a little bit of with Argentina. But they do it themselves. They do it to themselves. They have this dichotomy where the previous president really was all over Britain, and just, we're going to be friends, and we're going to and as soon as he said, hey, Malvinas is not that important, everybody just kind of looked at him like saying, what? And he backtracked. And he kind of did a double game with Britain. First he started saying, and then he had to say, Argentina does not renounce its, because he was going against the Constitution. Argentina put in the Constitution that we're going to continue honoring this until it gets resolved. And so he changed politics. And then you saw, it always goes hand in hand with how friendly financial ventures and banks and Israel and the money in New York and everything. If you have a president that says, hey, forget Malvinas, we don't care, whatever, let's be friends, let's do commerce, and the British see that they're genuine about that, all of a sudden they're great, they're wonderful. the ambassador is, hosting parties, and all the people in Argentina that feel that they're closer to aristocracy because they're closer to Europe or the British, and all that kind of frothles up, and then if that party loses and a Peronist comes back into power, and that traditionally it's a whole different political thing. I don't want to repeat myself. You actually see it. You actually see how all of a sudden, statements in British articles are no longer so nice to Argentina, and you see it everywhere. Because somehow this is really, although Britain doesn't talk about it to anybody, it's like their intimate little thing that they got with this country down there. And it is by people who are in government or in positions of financial power and are knowledgeable about world geopolitics and what have you. They like creatures on the tides of the ocean. If Argentina is standing on their sovereignty claim, they all kind of have something that they don't say in favor of Argentina. They only take it so far. They don't, and if all of a sudden Argentina has a government that is kind of on the favoring good relationships with the British and not talking about Malvinas, all of a sudden you start seeing overtures, and people start adding an extra adjective in their sentences when they talk about something that happened in Argentina. It's really incredible. But anyways, I don't know where I was going with that. This action represents Fernandez's peaceful intentions for the Falklands, especially Tierra del Fuego. Yeah, well, that is true. But it's not because, Fernandez caused something that is new. It's not, it says the British MPs, but garnered praise by domestic, but this has elicited little response from British MPs, but instead garnered praise by domestic campaigns of anti-occupation, especially in Tierra del Fuego region. So they're trying to blame him for creating a situation. He's just basically paying attention to something that's always there. Fernandez has made clear his intention to advance claims on sovereignty over the Falklands. Why advance claims? Why advance claims? It's always the same one. They include Georgia's, all the islands of the Antarctic region. They have a whole little map that they've decided is what their claim is. I personally have my own views. I'm more about justice needs to be done on Malvinas or Falklands. The islands that are in the periphery, Georgia, Sandwich of the South, thinking South Sandwich Islands, the Spanish were there, but they boil it into one thing. I articulate it personally, but that's just my personal thing. Fernandez has made clear his intention to advance sovereignty over the tweeting, "We will claim our sovereignty and shout forever, Argentine Malvinas." Yeah. So you should do that. We, as countries, we shouldn't just say, "Oh, well, they were more powerful. They kicked our people out of there," or, they actually robbed that territory. I'm not talking about the islands. I'm talking about any place in the world. It is not right to let war and military power decide the political geographical form of nations. That's wrong. It is about talking. We are better when we talk with each other as a family than if we beat our kids up to do what we tell them to do. So it is a better world if we don't have war decide the shape of the world. So there is nothing wrong with it. On the contrary, Argentina's doing the right thing. And it's not doing the wrong thing if it educates its children to not forget something that Argentina considers important because they had incorporated it into their territory. And there are, you could call them holding a grudge, that somebody took something from you or used their pistol to decide who has it, and it's up to you, but you have the right to do it. You have the right to stay mad at a friend for your entire life and never be his friend again for taking your girlfriend. Or you could be the kind of person that says, hey, I rise to the occasion, but and forgive you because I no longer love her or whatever, but it's still your prerogative. Argentina is doing absolutely nothing wrong in educating its kids to remember history and making sure that is settled, that is a country that they feel they started with. I don't know about the other islands out there, Georgia, those South Georgia and what have you, Sandwich Islands, but as far as Malvinas, it's a totally legitimate call to revision justice, and the two countries that were involved before the United Nations are still present in the United Nations, so it enters within the forum. I always have this, this discussion with people who say, well, then give back the land to the Mapuches or the Guarani in America. I guess they also mean you should give your land. Americans still say that. The British love to say that because they feel that their country was not built on natives, and so they have the upper hand. They can accuse the Spanish of creating nations out of the land of Indians, indigenous people. But the thing is, that whole argument never holds compared to Malvinas Falklands, because the only instrument that we have ever had, and the first instrument that we have had as a world to create diplomatic, conversational, logical, political discussion to solve our problems is the United Nations. It's the first time where the countries of the entire planet gather around a circle, and they can bring to that table matters as long as the countries present at that circle also existed when the time that they want to talk about. So theoretically, if the Persian Empire is considered by Iran as still its same nation as it is today, and I don't know, Pakistan or some country that you could say today is still the same, that's not a good example, but let's make something fictitious up. Egypt is still the same country today that it was 500 years ago. They're both present in the United Nations, and they both have a dispute that goes back 300 years, let's say. It's a viable means by true resolution, by virtue of the integrity of both nations being present back then and being present within the United Nations. We, for the first time, have an instrument that, if used properly, could, resolve the conflicts of the world in legitimate presence. To say that the United Nations should do something about a certain indigenous people that really didn't have the country that they say should be theirs. They were kind of spread out somewhere else, and they really didn't have a capital. They kind of had lots of little tribes, and they spoke the same language, and they claim today that they should have this part of Chile or this part of Argentina. And for the United Nations to get involved in that through ideological, civil ideological, social ideological thinking that has based on individual rights of self-determination to a generalized way, like everybody has that. And so if they have that, you have a magic wand and you can rebuild your country. What country is completely aberrant. That would not be the case. It's not useful for that. And the United Nations should not get involved in ideology, gender ideology, and indigenous. It's just going, apparently it has to occupy its efforts somewhere because it's not dedicating it towards bringing peace among today's nations, about real nations in the world that came into the United Nations together and are still there, and they're not using the United Nations to resolve their conflicts, so they're going somewhere else, and they're not supposed to support wars, but they send troops that are not with the British or the Americans. They're the United Nations. It's doing whatever. In any case, the Falklands and Malvinas do enter in such a possibility, even though the conflict started 187 years ago, because both countries, England and Argentina, are still here, and they're both present at the United Nations. There is no comparison to saying, well, then give back the Aztec to the Aztecs, free them from Spanish language or whatever they want to invent next. Okay. Let's finish this. I'm going to make it as long as the other one. Jesus. This action represents domestic campaigns, occupation, Tierra del Fuego. Okay. Fernandez made clear his intentions to advance claims on sovereignty over that, tweeting, we will, okay. Claim of sovereignty forever. On the surface, in 1982, and on the surface, we're back to the article here. On the surface, 1982 and 2020 share many of the same key factors for Argentina. The writer is saying this. But this comparison must be taken less literally. I wonder what he wants to say. This analysis will avoid the... I think he's announcing something he's going to say later. This analysis will avoid the pessimistic prognosis of that 2020 will result in the invasion of the Falklands. Instead, it is more likely that Argentina will seek a peaceful solution. Argentina is in no position, never was, even when the junta was, I mean, we're talking about fighting a country that is not alone, that they have agreed with the United States and all the other NATO countries to stick together in their military missions. There is no hypothesis for Argentina ever considering a military solution. Even during the juntas, these are countries, are they going to allow one of their NATO members to be humiliated? That was never going to happen. What the Argentinians and the British narrative, because it is in the British narrative to not have Argentina look like a rape victim, or that they really knew what they were doing and they were going in there to step all over them and to keep the Falklands for good in '82. It's in their best interest to always, every once in a while, say, they're pilots. They were magnificent. They flew over the ocean at at 1 foot of height, at a foot height. Okay. Anyways, it all enters in the narrative that is now being disseminated. You don't want to say that. They don't want to say that we were just planning on how long it was going to take us to beat them, and we had agreed with America that if by any chance they managed to sink, too many ships or afflict too many casualties, we had plan B or plan D, and America would send us this or that, and we would continue to appear to be the only ones fighting the war, except we'd be dropping bombs in factories in Cordoba and other cities in Argentina. And so the war was never going to be lost. But this can't enter the British narrative, can't it? Because then if you start, how does that make sense? Well, it makes sense if you always knew that Argentina could not last 3 or 4 months max with the armament and the training it had. They were going to run out of bullets in another few weeks anyways, whether they had surrendered or not. So to say those things then proposes other questions like, well, if you knew that, then why weren't you able to, from a position of strength, do something which avoided killing 900 people in a war? and flexed your muscles in other ways. Why did you have to have a war on the islands? You could ask Thatcher. And I don't know if we'll ever know that, because only a fly on the wall knows what she conceded to, what she agreed with in chambers with Leach, I think it was his name, her military advisor, and people that maybe had been back and forth talking to Washington on planning on what they were going to do. So, yeah, okay. Well, it doesn't sound as interesting as I thought it was going to be. Instead, it's more likely that Argentina will seek appeal. Of course, Argentina just always wanted to resolve this diplomatically from the beginning. It's not what this article is painting, that they're not going to have a choice. And although they would consider using military aggression, we got to make sure that we always consider that threat a viable possibility. The desire within Argentina to once again dispute the Falklands is evident. Why once again? They never stopped. They never stopped, arguing with Britain. They always sought justice for the events of 1833. But by making it seem like Argentina every once in a while wakes up, with the mood to go fight this, it makes the reader feel like what the British have to put up with, right? And key to understanding the potential results in these claims are competitive economics. Yeah, I think that it has always been more the British interest to see what they can get from the islands. And as soon as it was suspected there was oil in the 70s, I believe, is when they kind of knew there was oil underneath. That is what profoundly motivated. But of course, the British don't want to appear like cold, materialistic invaders. Or usurpers of diplomatic justice. They had to make it about the islanders, and it was all about the islanders. And that way, people in the world can go, oh, it's noble. It's a human issue. It's right to self-determination. The Argentinians, on the other hand, really did care about the human, the offense, the moral aspect of having been disrespected, territory taken from them that they considered was theirs, and the whole respect and the honor of respecting a country and fighting for that respect and for that honor. It was always that. Later, they kind of adopted, as always, I guess because they thought maybe it strengthened their claim or their protest, which has always been more of a protest. It was never been so much a claim. A word claim works better for the British narrative because it's like we're arguing over something. It's really a protest about what they were afflicted, how they were usurped, how territory was taken from them in 1833. They feel was